Good evening. My name's Andy. I'm one of the wine specialists based in the Waitrose in the basement of John Lewis Oxford Street, and I'm with you this evening to talk about port. I haven't done a wine tasting online for a little while now, but I did a straw poll of some of our regular customers, and the overall consensus was that people wanted me to talk about port. People wanted to understand more about port, how it's made, its history, what the different styles are about, what it tastes like, what sort of foods it goes with. And as luck would have it, I've got 4 samples from one of the oldest port houses, Taylor's, which cover pretty much the entire spectrum of port styles, and will give me lots to talk about, lots to get my teeth into. If you're watching and you can see me and hear me, then please let me know in the comments on the site. Likewise, if you have any questions as we go along, do leave them in the comments on the site, and I'll do my best to address them. So port, what is port? Port is a fortified wine. That means that the wine has had neutral grape spirit added to it. You can call it brandy if you like, but it's brandy that hasn't been aged in oak barrels. It wouldn't be familiar to a lover of cognac. It's clear, it's largely odourless and tasteless. It's distilled to a high degree of purity. Some port houses regard the spirit as very neutral and not very important. Other houses, like Taylor's, go to great lengths to ensure the quality of the spirit that they use to fortify their wines. Port has to come from the Douro Valley in Portugal. It's one of the oldest, I think it's the 3rd vineyard area in the world to be classified and protected as such. The oldest would be Tokaj in Hungary, and that was followed by Chianti a few years later. All of this was in the 18th century, and then port came along on the back of that. Taylor's is a very it's a very British sounding name. An awful lot of the port houses are named for the family or the person that founded or was involved in the creation of it, and Taylor's is no exception. But the house wasn't founded by a chap called Taylor. It was founded in 1692 by Job Beersley. Now, Job was an English wine merchant who bought wines in Portugal, shipped them back to Britain, and he had a partner in London who would do the selling for him. And his family established themselves in the Douro, in Oporto, which was the major port for shipping. And I guess she's only in the other room, so I hope she's got good reception. So a lot of British families set up, a lot of British merchants set up in Porto to ship the wines of the Douro Valley and the Minho and northern Portugal. But it was Job's son, Peter, who he was the first English merchant to make the journey upriver to the upper Douro, where the finest wines were being grown, to see for himself what was going on, to meet the growers in person, and to make these annual trips, as they became, to purchase the wine. And then Bartholomew, his son, so the grandson of Job, became the first British shipper to buy land in the Douro, with the Lugar das Lagas, which is still owned by Taylor's today, and that was purchased in 1744. Now, by this point, you've got several Beersley descendants in partnership in the family, and the last surviving Beersley, Francis, when he died, his three sons-in-law inherited the firm, and that included a Dr. Gray of Gray's Anatomy fame, I believe, not the TV series, the book, but they were very hands-off owners, and they gave day-to-day management of the firm to a Turkish American by the name of Joseph Camo. And this is important that he was an American, because this was around the time of the Napoleonic Wars, the Peninsular Wars, and Porto changed hands between the French and the British, well, the Portuguese and the British, who were allies. They're our oldest allies. The oldest treaty we hold as a country is with Portugal, and so the French and the British were at war right across the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, and some pretty fierce battles were fought around Portugal. In fact, one of Taylor's properties was used as a hospital by British troops during the Napoleonic Wars. But Joseph Camo was able to maintain the business because he was an American. The French saw him as, well, at worst, as neutral. If the Americans were considered allies for most of the period by the French, and so he was able to carry on business under their nose, and even managed to ship out some wines from Porto to London against the French blockade. Quite an achievement. So he kept the house going, and here's a lovely quote from a historian called Charles Sellers, who wrote a history, a Porto Old and New, which was published in 1899, and his quote is about Joseph: typical American, full of energy, fertile in resource, and never wanting in pluck. Three qualities absolutely indispensable in these distressful days. He really saved the company. Joseph Taylor, the first tailor of the eponymous house, comes into the story in 1814. He's working for the company as an accountant, really, as a scribe, and he's given shares in the company, is made partner in 1814, and then in 1826, as other partners died off or went bankrupt, he became the sole owner. So he was a sole owner in 1826. Now, he himself didn't have family to leave the company to, so he leaves it to two English wine merchants called Morgan Yateman and John Fladgate. And it's their descendants who carry the firm through the rest of the 19th and into the 20th century. Right, so the bottle I've got in front of us here is the Vargellas, Taylor's Vargellas. Vargellas is a quinta, a single quinta, or an estate or a vineyard in the Upper Douro. It's one of the finest vineyard sites in the world, bar none. Its history predates Taylor's. Its fame predates the wines that we know today as port. There was a big argument at the turn of the 18th, 19th century as to whether or not port should be fortified, whether or not brandy should be added to it. So one wonders what the ports of the 18th, 17th centuries were like. Were they strong and sweet in the way that we know them today, or were they more akin to the Douro table wines, which have become quite fashionable of late? And there is quite a lot of the Douro which is flat and fertile and eminently suitable for mechanisation and for making table wines. But the Vargellas is a quinta, is a vineyard in the Upper Douro, and it's the famous terraces that you see photographs of, which have been hacked out of the granite and schist of the hillside, so that there was enough flat territory for the vines to be planted on. And these vines have to work really hard for their living. It is hot and arid, and although you have a river, the Douro, running through the vineyards, precious little of that water gets up onto the terraces. If you visit Porto, you may get the impression that that part of Spain is quite wet. It's on the western seaboard, the Atlantic seaboard of Portugal, and it gets quite a bit of rainfall. It gets fogs that come in off the ocean. It can be actually quite chilly in the winter. They don't get snow, but it's pretty temperate, and it's a very oceanic climate. But as you go inland from Porto, you have to cross pretty much a mountain range before you come down the other side into the Douro Valley. And so the Douro has this quite exciting journey from its source to its source in Spain, where it's known as the Duero, comes in all the way through Portugal and then out to sea. And it's been tamed today by dams, hydroelectric dams, and there's a railway that runs up the Douro, which one of the great railway journeys of the world. If you visit Portugal, you go to Porto, and you want to go up into the Douro and visit the vineyards, go by train. It's wonderful. It's much better than going by road. Beautiful, wonderfully scenic route. The railway itself seems to have been hacked into the rock, into the cliff face in parts. It's a very dramatic railway journey, and Vargeles actually has its own railway station. It's on the railway line, which is fantastic. It's only a short walk from the railway to visit the vineyard. But these, once you get inland, it's much drier and much hotter. So while it might be quite cool in Porto, and this is where the ports are matured, in Villanova de Gaia, which is the town or city on the opposite bank of the Douro River to Porto. It's where all the port lodges are based and where they mature their wines in damp, cool cellars. You go up into the Douro, and the temperatures can reach 40 degrees at midday, fairly consistently right through the summer. It's a hellacious environment in which to work, and it's not somewhere where you would maybe choose to farm if you were starting from scratch. And this is an issue for the port growers, is attracting people to work in the Douro, because they're challenging conditions, and these terraces are such that the soils and the topography are such that you can't mechanise. You can't take a tractor into the vineyard. There's very little you can do by way of mechanisation. So Vargeles was famous. Phylloxera at the end of the 19th century devastated the vineyards, as it did right through Europe. Phylloxera is a pest that was imported on the roots of American vines that were brought over as a fancy, really. But the means of re-establishing the vineyards was to graft the European wine vine onto the rootstock of the American vine that had brought the pest over, that kind of lives in a parasitic symbiotic relationship with phylloxera, can withstand the depredations of phylloxera, unlike the European wine vine, which has very juicy roots, very attractive to phylloxera. It would eat the roots, the vine would die. And it absolutely devastated the Upper Douro, the areas where the best quality ports were made. And Vargeles was one of the first vineyards to be replanted. Frank Yateman, who was in charge of the Portuguese end of the business, his brother looked after business in London doing the selling. Frank, who was nicknamed Smiler, because of his bonhomie with the growers and with the Portuguese. Smiler oversaw the replanting of Vargeles to some considerable personal cost. The Yatemans and the Flaggates put back in a great deal of the money that they had drawn out of the business in profit over the years into re-establishing the vineyards post-phylloxera in the before the First World War and between the wars. At one point, I think production in Vergellas had fallen to as little as 4 pipes or 4 barrels of wine for the entire vineyard because there were so few productive vines growing. And they restored it. And Smiler, in his run as head of the company, oversaw 50 harvests, 50 vintages. Now, that's enough of the history. You'll have to forgive me because I forgot to bring my glass of ice through. So I'm just going to go and get some ice. I'll be back in a second. Sorry, brief intermission. Hope you were talking amongst yourselves. I hope somebody else is watching, apart from my lovely wife. Do leave me a comment. Let me know that you're out there. Right, so the first port I'm going to try with you is a port that, a style, in fact, that Taylor's invented. Taylor's popularised. Chip dry white port was born in 1934. White port is made with different varieties to red and tawny port. Malvasia is the main grape variety, and the other varieties, there are literally hundreds of permitted varieties in the Douro. There's probably about a dozen responsible for the vast majority of port, but most ports are a field blend. The grape varieties are grown higgledy-piggledy in amongst one another, and it's only because of some very careful work by plant botanists that we know what most of the varieties are. So anyway, this is Taylor's Chip Dry. I'll be honest. I'm gonna try this neat. I'm not the biggest fan of white port. When I first visited the Douro, that's the colour. So it's been matured in barrel for a number of years before it's bottled, and Taylor's ferment chip dry for a little longer before they fortify it, which gives it a drier style than the majority of white ports. Hence chip dry. Now on the nose, it has got a grapey character to it. You think white muscat grapes, and there's the oxidase. There's a nuttiness to it, a scent like almonds, toasted almonds. And that is quite dry. There's a little bit of residual sweetness, but it's pretty dry. Now I've had this in the fridge. I would only ever serve white port chilled, but when I first visited the Douro, I kind of expressed my my dislike of the first white port that I tried, and my hosts laughed and said, "Well, you're not drinking it properly." How do you mean? So no, how do the Portuguese, how do the port houses themselves serve white port? With tonic, port and tonic, P&T, as opposed to a G&T. So you can be quite generous adding your port to the glass because it's half the proof of gin. And then what I've learnt to do is to add a sprig or two of mint, and the process of plucking and rolling the leaves is usually enough to release some oils into. I'm going to use a lot because I like mint, and then squeeze of lemon, and a hefty slug of tonic. I've gone with Fentimans here. It's the tonic I had to hand this evening, but fever to each webs. Whatever your preferred variety of tonic. Give that a swirl. If you're being fancy and you're preparing it for your guests, you can add a wheel of lemon to garnish. But and that is really refreshing. That's delicious, and it's a wonderful aperitif. It's a wonderful hot summer's day drink. But do you know what? Because of the underlying flavours of the port, it's a really nice all year round aperitif. It's not just for hot weather. That's absolutely lovely. Now, the mint just gives an aromatic lift to the whole thing. So Taylor's invents white port in 1934. In 1970, they invented LBV, late bottled vintage. Now, we haven't really discussed the styles. So we've talked about white port. White port made with white grape varieties. The juice is fermented and grape spirit, brandies added to it to stop the fermentation at some point along the time, late in chip dry, so it's dry. And then it's aged in wooden barrels. That's your white port. Now, you have two principal styles made with the black grapes, the red grapes, and they would be vintage or late bottle vintage, ruby ports, which are styled bottle-aged ports, and then you've got the wood-aged ports, which are epitomised by the tawnies, and the one we're going to try this evening is the Taylor's 10-year-old tawny. Now, there are mechanical ways of treading the grapes these days. Some wonderfully inventive things. One called a robotic ligare, which actually has sort of nylon feet on stainless steel legs that marches up and down through the grapes. One of the reasons why the port houses have had to be so creative in creating in their winemaking techniques of late is because of the difficulties of getting young people to work in the industry. Traditionally, the pickers would harvest the grapes during the day and tread the grapes during the night, and then get up the following morning. I say get up the following morning, I don't know if they even got time to go to bed, and harvest again. And it's back-breaking work. Vintage in a vineyard is hard work anyway, but when you've got to tread the grapes as well, it really is hard work. Now, the grapes are, say, Quinta de Vargelas or any of other Taylor's other main estate will be harvested, and the grapes themselves will be destemmed and then tipped into these what they call stone lagares. The lagares are the fermenting tanks, if you like, for port, and they're about thigh deep. And there's two stages to pressing the grapes, and the first stage is to crush the grapes. And so all the pickers will get into the tank. All the guys who are going to crush the grapes, tread the grapes, get into the tank, link arms, and march backwards and forwards through the grapes, usually accompanied by some music. These days it'd probably be the radio, but traditionally it was a guy with the corner with an accordion. He probably had the easiest job of the lot. They march backwards and forwards, crushing the grapes. And then as the grapes give up their juice and the skins have been pressed into the juice, giving up their colour, the pickers will let go of one another and start marching out independently. It looks quite amusing to a bystander, but what they're doing is they're breaking up the cap. They're making sure that the skins are squashed down back into the juice and it doesn't form a solid cap over the wine. And they carry on doing that until the wine starts to ferment. It starts to heat up. it starts to bubble away, and the sugars start to get converted into alcohol. And there's a point at which the winemaker will decide, right, that's it, all stop. They'll get out of the lagare at that point. The cap will solidify effectively. The skins will all float to the top, pushed up in addition by the carbon dioxide from the fermentation as well. They'll float on the top, and the juices are run off from underneath into, usually these days it would be a stainless steel tank. Historically it would have been a series of wooden barrels. And at this point, that neutral grape spirit is added to the wine to stop the fermentation, takes the strength to about 20% alcohol, and yeast, somewhat bizarrely, yeast is killed by its own byproduct, so the yeast dies, the fermentation stops, and you're left with a naturally sweet wine. These wines are then shipped from the Douro down to the port lodges in Villanova de Gaia, and the ports are tasted, they're sampled, and it's determined at this point what they're going to go towards, whether they're going to be a ruby port. For a young ruby port, it'll be vatted in a large stainless steel or wooden vat, where it'll get very little wood contact and very little oxygen contact, and you'll end up with a bright ruby port, dark ruby in colour, with lots of primary fruits. If you decide that it's a particularly age-worthy port, then after a couple of years that port will be put into the bottle unfiltered, and it'll become a vintage port. And at that point, 2 years after the harvest, traditionally on St George's Day, 26th of April, the port houses will announce a vintage, declare a vintage, and that will usually be a blend of wines from across the port houses' top estate. Some port houses have really fine vineyards that, even in, if you like, non-declared, non-vintage years, undeclared years, they'll bottle a single quinta, a single vineyard vintage wine, and that's what we've got with the Vargelas. This is from Taylor's top estate, and the one I've got is 2004. If you bought a bottle from me in the last few days, it'll be the 2005, because that's what we've currently got on the shelf. And I've had these samples from Taylor's in the stockroom for about a year, because we haven't been able to do anything with them in store all year. So Taylor's were the first major port house to launch a single quinta wine onto the market too. So 1934 they create Chip Dry. 1970 they released the first late bottle vintage with their 1965 vintage. And in 1987 they released the first Quinta de Vargelas, and I can remember this was not long after I'd started in the wine trade. The 1987 Quinta de Vargelas was released in '89, and I think I first tried it in 1989 actually, and I was absolutely bowled over by it. Then as now, vintage port, declared vintage port, was jolly expensive stuff. I mean, most declared vintage ports today are between 60 and 90 pounds when they're released, and mature vintage port is getting increasingly hard to come by, but it's anywhere between 60 and 200 pounds depending on the vintage, and then for the really old ones you're looking at going to auction to get hold of them. They are wines that age in the bottle exceptionally well, because they have everything. They have alcohol, acidity, tannin, fruit. Everything is there to ensure that the wine's got a long life ahead of it in the bottle. So tawny is the other way of aging a port. So rather than aging it in the bottle, it's aged in the cask, and rather than in giant vats, it's typically aged in port pipes of about 500 litres. Quite a generous barrel. I guess the cellar hands in the Douro are a little tougher than elsewhere in Europe, because most barrels in the wine business are around 250 litres. So port pipe is twice the size of a normal barrel, but then it doesn't get manhandled that much. Once it's arrived in its cellar in Porto, there it will stay, and it will stay there for a considerable length of time. Tailors have got stocks of tawny ports going right back into the mid-19th century. Some of the oldest tawnies available, and the style of tawny was defined by the Instituto de Vino de Porto, or the IVP, in the 1970s, 1973, and that same year, tailors took advantage of the new regulations to launch their 10, 20, 30 and 40-year-old tawny. We stock the 10, the 20, we stock the 10, the 30 and the 40. We have other 20-year-old tawnies, but we don't do the tailor's 20, which is a shame, because if you add up all of those, you've got 100 years. So you get 100 years of port in and in fact tailors presented that with rather cute 20 centilitre bottles, the 10, the 20, the 30 and the 40. You add them all up together, you get 100 years. It's quite a nice gift. So the regulations state that a 10-year-old tawny, the wines are not, unlike say a whiskey where if it says it's a 10-year-old whiskey, it has to be at least 10 years old. That's not the case with port. It's a kind of it's kind of an average age. It's a style as much as anything else. So in addition to it having to have the age itself, it also has to be tasted for typicity, and the members of the IVP taste each house's aged tawnies and declare whether or not they are fit to be called a 10, a 20, a 30 or a 40. They're a style as much as an age statement, although the age statement is there to be taken seriously. There are one or two markets like the United States where an age statement is there to be taken literally, and you cannot get away with saying this is in the style of a 10-year-old and it may contain some 6-year-old ports. So most port houses actually treat it as a minimum age, so that they don't have to jump through any hoops in any overseas markets. So you will find that this 10-year-old is what it says on the tin. It's a 10-year-old tawny. So the differences. Tawny ports have this oxidative aging environment. The oxygen's getting at them through the wood. The barrels are kept topped up. They're not allowed to diminish. A lot evaporates, even in the cooler cellar climates in Villanova de Gaia than they would have done up in the Douro. But the barrels are topped up one from another. So for a 10-year-old tawny, you'd be losing around 2 to 3% to evaporation each year. That's going to be water and alcohol. So cumulatively, if you started with 500 pipes to make your 10-year-old, you'd finish up with about 420. You'd lose that volume over time. And then with the 20-year-old, you'd lose significantly more, 30 and 40 and so on. So when tailors came to bottle a vintage, or colheita, they're called colheita, Colheita, vintage tawny, when they launched their 1964, I think 3 barrels remaining of some 90 barrels of the initial wine that was held back. So an awful lot of concentration is going on. So one of the things you'll notice from the 10 to the 20 to the 30 to the 40, what you'll notice is you get more of the oxidative notes. So more dried fruit, more of a nutty character, and more concentration. So the 10-year-old, which I've got here, which I'm serving chilled, incidentally. I like my tawny ports chilled. They're very, very versatile in style. I'll come to that in a moment. So you have a look at the colour of this. You can see that. It's got that tawny character. So we get that nice and, yeah. So there's still, because it's a 10-year-old, you've still got flashes of the original ruby colour in its core, and it still has some of the primary fruit character, but caramel, nuts and dried fruits, things like prunes rather than plums, figs, it tends to be quite figgy, and I find that with the 20-year-old that's enhanced, the 30-year-old even more. When you get to the 40-year-old, the characteristics are almost balsamic. Because of that degree of concentration. You've lost all this water and alcohol over the years, and everything else has been concentrated together. The miracle is that they select these barrels each year to ensure that what they're bottling is up to scratch. If something becomes too concentrated, they'll blend it in with other lighter barrels to ensure that the house style stays consistent. So your 10-year-old tawny from Taylor's is going to be pretty consistent from one purchase to the next. There's a lovely nutty character, walnuts, raisins, prunes, figs. This stuff is wonderful chilled with desserts, warm desserts, cake, puddings, cheese. It works remarkably well. You substitute, think of it as a dessert wine, and you're not far wrong. Think of it as a fireside sipping wine, and you're absolutely bang on. It's really versatile. I think tawny is possibly my favourite style of port, because it's the easiest to match with the most variety of foods. The older tawnies, the walnut becomes absolutely lovely, and you get a sort of leathery note as well. They're absolutely delicious. Yes, Vanessa, you're saying evaporated and topped up with what? Topped up with more of the same. So they start off with, say, 100 barrels and use one of those barrels to top up the losses to evaporation from the other barrels each year. So they are constantly sacrificing a barrel to maintain the rest of the barrels full from one year to the next. So gradually the number of barrels decreases as time goes by until you get to the point where you're going to bottle them. It's quite a sacrificial process, laborious as well, and time consuming. But the results are really well worth it. So that's tawny. Now we're going to try the LBV, the late bottle vintage, and this, as I say, is a style that Taylor's invented. This is something that they created. The idea was to create a port that you wouldn't have to decant, you wouldn't have to filter, that you would just be able to pick up, take home, open, and enjoy, and get the character from to get the character from wine, the character of a vintage port, without the vintage vintage price, and without the ceremony of decanting it. Now, it's interesting that you've got two stoppers when it comes to port. You have the tea cork or stopper, you can get out as easily as that, and you have the driven cork, which we've got in the vintage port, which I'll come to in a minute. Now, they're an indicator of what that's how the port is intended to be served, as well as whether or not it'll age. So if it has a driven cork like the vintage port, then it's an indication that the port will age in the bottle. If it's got a tea cork or a stopper like this that you can take out, put back easily, then the port doesn't require aging, it's ready to drink. Indeed, in the case of tawnies, they're not considered age-worthy in the bottle. They've done their aging. They've done their aging in the cask. Why did my father's generation think that tawny should be served warm? I don't know. The first time I tried Tio Pepe sherry, it was served warm, and it was awful. Warm Fino is just nasty. But if you serve it cold, chilled, ice cold, it's thrilling stuff. Honestly, I don't think they were that far off all of the time. I mean, you know, my nan drank port and lemon. I've just had a port and tonic with a slice of lemon. They were so close but so far. You know, white port and... Sorry, I'm getting more of the mint from that. It's infused into the drink more. God, that's lovely. So, you know, our forebears, bless them, had different traditions. I think, why would we drink port warm? You know, ice was a luxury well into the 1950s. Pubs didn't routinely have refrigerators until the 1950s, 1960s, even the 1970s. We were famous as a nation of warm beer, of no ice in our cocktails. If you watch films like Passport to Pimlico, you can tell whether the drinking establishments consider posh or not as to whether or not they get ice in their drink, or indeed whether their drink comes out of a fridge. You know, lager couldn't take off in this country until we had refrigerated serve, because there really is nothing worse than warm lager, except perhaps warm Fino sherry. So LBV, it does literally mean what it says on the label. A vintage port, as I said, is declared bottled 2 years after the harvest. A late bottled vintage will be bottled sometime between 4 and 6 years after the vintage. It's aged in vats, large vats, not 500-litre pipes like the tawny port. And then in the case of Taylor's LBV, it is filtered before it's bottled, so that it doesn't throw a significant sediment in the bottle, which means you can simply open it and drink it. You don't have to decant it. There are some styles, Wars do a great example, of unfiltered LBV, and the port then will generally have a driven cork rather than a stopper, and it will continue to improve in the bottle because it's got those elements that will enable it to age. So what do we get from from our LBV? Well, for a start, have a look at the colour. Okay, so that is deep purple in colour. It's pink at the rim, which is an indicator of youth in a wine, in a red wine. And I always used to tell people not to worry too much about this business when starting out in wine tasting, but if you swirl it in the glass and then hold it still, you'll see what we rather poetically call legs or tears forming on the side of the glass, running back down into the wine, and they're broadly an indicator of alcohol content and viscosity. But you'll see lots of legs forming on a bottle, on a port, because there's 20% alcohol there, and it is very apparent. But swirling it in the glass like that also increases the surface area of the wine coating the glass to evaporate and to concentrate the aromas. So the aromas now are black cherry, plum, blackcurrant, blackberry, dark fruits, forest fruits. And some sweeter notes like chocolate and caramel. But they're more evident in the tawny. Now, compared with a regular table wine, you can feel the heat of the alcohol, the 20% alcohol, no question. But it's balanced by the weight, the concentration of the wine. Lots of black fruit. Sweetness and acidity nicely in balance so that it's not cloying. If you think honey is sweet wine without the balance in acidity, nobody drinks honey. I mean, even if you dilute it, it's still too sticky. You need the acidity that the grapes naturally have in them to pull that off. The colour here is all from the skins of the grapes. It's all been extracted by those guys marching backwards and forwards, treading the grapes. Incidentally, I have done that at Sandeman's Quinta de Val. I've trodden the grapes during the harvest, and I can tell you that it is the best exfoliant known to man. This man hasn't used much in the way of exfoliants. You might be able to tell, but my legs were as smooth as a baby's bottom for weeks afterwards, and it took quite a while to get the colour out of my legs as well. It's kind of purplish colour from halfway down my thigh. Maybe another good reason to buy a filtered port would be you don't get any other products of that exfoliation, but works really well with strong salty or blue cheeses. It also works surprisingly well with fresh fruit, with a bunch of grapes, with a cut up apple, with a fruit salad. A glass of port is quite lovely, and it's one of the better accompaniments to a fine cigar as well. A lot of people will take brandy with a cigar or whiskey with a cigar, and you've got to have a really rich, powerfully flavoured spirit to stand up to a good smoke, whereas actually a port is many times is a more suitable accompaniment. It works better. Now, that's late bottle vintage, and that I suspect is the wine that the majority of people will have chosen to accompany this tasting. I'm sorry I took so long to get to it. For those of you like Anne and Nick who chose to hold off for the main event, if you like, for the Quinta de Vargelas, the vintage port, I do apologise if you've been waiting all this time for a drink. And to those of you, and I know there are some people out there who bought all 4 ports to take part this evening, do remember that you don't have to consume them all at once, and these will keep for a while. The white and the tawny will keep for several weeks in the fridge. Tawnies keep really quite well because they've been aged in an oxidative environment. They don't go stale as quickly as the ruby ports. The LBV is probably going to last in the bottle for a week or so. The vintage port I would consider drinking up within the week, and to enjoy it at its best within three or 4 days of decanting. So this is where I've made myself a real hostage to fortune. I said that I would open and decant a bottle of vintage port live online. So here we go. The corkscrew I'm using for this is a pocket screw pull, and I'll explain why. It's the wonder of a screw pull is that the screw thread goes down into the cork and removes the cork in a very, very gentle, continuous process. And that's great when with a vintage port, you've had it standing for a day or two upright so that the sediment has fallen down, that hasn't adhered to the bottle, that's fallen down into the foot of the bottle. And you don't want to shake things up. You want to do everything as gently as possible. And so a nice gentle action corkscrew is ideal, and I find the screw cork's absolutely perfect for that. Now I'm just going to cut off the capsule. You can take as much or as little care with the capsule as you like. Doesn't really matter. The little paper strip that goes over the top is your proof that what you've got is a genuine Portuguese port. The IVP provides these seals to each of the port houses to use to certify that what they are selling you is genuine port. You can buy tawnies and rubies from all over the world. We sell a lovely 21-year-old tawny from Australia, but it is not a port. It cannot call itself a port. It's that delimited area that is unique to the Douro Valley, to Porto, to Portugal. Okay, now that's the corkscrew. I've taken the capsule off. Decanter. What sort of decanter do I recommend? Well, to be honest with you, a milk jug will do the job, because what I often do is once I've decanted the port, I'll rinse out the bottle with hot water, and then pour the port back into the bottle. Now it's not got its sediment, and I can put a stopper in the bottle and enjoy it at my leisure. But I would say if you're going to decant and enjoy the ceremony of it, it's nice to have an attractive decanter. The most important thing about a decanter is that it pours well, and the second most important thing is that it's easy to pour into. So that, more than anything else, is most important. I've got two here. This one here is from the John Lewis Connoisseur range, and it's the one I'm going to use. It's a ship's decanter. It's made of a variant of crystal called Sonics, which is just a bit tougher. It's kind of a good thing in my household when I'm washing up the number of glasses that get broken, stemware, decanters, whatever. So it's good to have something a bit tougher, and it's we actually guarantee that it will pour well, but this particular example does. And the other one I've got is altogether finer, although it looks a bit more like a specimen bottle. It is actually an ideal decanter, and this is from Dartington. This is a Dartington glass decanter, and it does the job beautifully. And again, it pours really well. In fact, it's easier to get the last drop out of this decanter than it is out of the ship's decanter. So I've got my decanter, I've got my bottle, I've got my corkscrew. Here goes. So I'm going to get that started. It comes with a neat little handle. I apologise to anybody who feels this is like watching paint dry. you have my sympathy. The other great thing is that these corkscrews are pretty good at removing recalcitrant corks, and this is proving to be one such. The cork has actually broken halfway down, and this is an issue with mature bottle-aged wines, and I might have been better off using an arceau, or butler's thief, which is a two-pronged device that slides down either side of the cork and withdraws the whole thing. I said I'd made myself hostage to fortune. I really have here. And straight away things are going wrong, and the cork is breaking up. So I'm going to try and remove as much as I can. Sod's law, eh? Okay, that's about as far as I'm going to get with that. So I've pushed the remains of the cork into the bottle. Okay, now that, in a sense, that saves my blushes, because I was going to demonstrate, I am going to demonstrate, the hell with it. So we're just going to start very, very gently decanting. And now I've got a bit of light behind here so I can see how clear the wine is as it pours. And the trick is to pour it in one steady motion. And you can see that the wine is pouring nice and clear. And we'll keep that wine going into the decanter in one steady move. And we're nearly there. Most of the bottle is out. Now at this point I start to slow down. You've just got a trickle of wine, and you're watching for the very first indication of any sediment. And this is a very well behaved bottle once I got the cork in and out, and the sediment has stuck very firmly to the side of the bottle and the base, and I'm left with, there we go, just the first signs of sediment. I'm left with just, I don't know if you can see through the bottle, let's tilt that that way. There's about 5 centilitres, maybe a little less, left in the bottle there. Now there's quite a bit of sediment in there. I'm not going to attempt to pour any more wine off of that. That's going to make a marvellous gravy. There's no need to waste it. It's absolutely lovely. That business with the fragile cork, Sue, you said nice to know even the professionals can have problems. Oh yes, oh yes. I've opened, decanted and poured wine at table in some fine dining, and had the cork break. Had issues with that before. This is not what we'd call a corked wine. I often get bottles of wine returned at work by people who've come across a cork just like this, a crumbling cork, and they've got bits of cork floating on the surface of the wine, or the wine's been hard to remove from the bottle, or they haven't even been able to get the last half of the cork out at all, and so they return it as corked. It's a common misconception, but this is not corked. A corked wine is a wine that is contaminated by a chemical that has first contaminated the cork. The most common cause of cork taint is a chemical called TCA, or trichloroanisole, and it's a byproduct really of the cork manufacture process. There are ways to avoid it. Obviously, a screw cap is one way, but most cork comes from Portugal. You're not going to find many ports bottled with a screw cap. Oh, Anne's not offering to make gravy. Ooh, that's that is quite an offer. I may take you up on that. Yeah, if you have this issue, don't worry about it. The cork is not going to taint or contaminate the wine unless you know, the cork was first contaminated with something like TCA, and in which case the wine's irrecoverable, and it doesn't matter whether the cork falls in or not, whether there's crumbs of cork floating on the wine or not. The unfortunate truth is that once a wine is corked, it's corked, and there really isn't anything you can do about it. I have a little gadget. It's a wine funnel here. It's got a nice, you can see it's got a nice filter built into it, and that's quite nifty if you have got a problem with a broken cork and you want to get the rest of the bottle out. You just pop it in the decanter like that, pour the wine in, and then fish it out again afterwards. And this is quite nifty for young wines too, because it aerates them. There are two principal reasons for decanting a wine. One is because it's thrown a sediment like this wine, and the other is that the wine needs to breathe, to get some air into it, and this helps to soften the tannins and smooth out the edges in a young wine. If you're serving a particularly old wine, I would suggest decanting it as near as possible to the point of consumption. Some wines after 20 or 30 years or more in the bottle become really quite fragile, and while they might have the most extraordinary bouquet when you first open them, they can be dead as a doornail 20 minutes later. So if you decant the wine an hour in advance, you may find yourself left with next to nothing to enjoy of your wine when you come round to it. Young wines, on the other hand, can be decanted several hours in advance and still continue to improve into the next day. Some young wines taste much better the day after they've been opened, and you've had half a bottle the first day, save the other half the next day, and they taste even better, which is a bit like my casseroles. They almost invariably taste better the second day. I always say that to guests because, of course, they only get to try it on the first day, and I get the leftovers the following day. So if they're not too impressed with the casserole, I say, "Ah, yes, but you should try it on the second day. It's marvellous then." Right, so vintage port, and what's it taste like? For those of you who are tasting along at home and have waited to this moment, Anne and Nick, I'm thinking of you. I do hope that you've already got some in your glass, and maybe you've been enjoying it already. Because that's an awful thing to have to wait. Now this is considerably older than our LBV. The LBV I've got is the 2013. We're selling the 2015 vintage in store at the moment, and the Quinta de Vargelas I've got is the 2004, and the vintage we're selling in work at the moment is the 2005. So there's not that much difference between our wines, but there's 10 years in it between the LBV and the vintage, and the vintage is opaque. You simply cannot see through it. It's almost black. This is still an infant. It's drinkable now, but it will happily save this decanter. Just making my head look very strange. Refraction. This will age quite happily for another 10 to 15 years. So we've essentially got the same fruit characteristics as we got in the LBV. It's blackcurrant and plum and cherry, black cherry, but there's more of it. There's more concentration. It's round. It's more rounded. It's softer. There's dry tannin there, which is an indication of how relatively young this wine still is. It's softer than it would have been at time of bottling 2 years after harvest. But my goodness, it's licorice, all sorts of fruits and spices combining on the tongue there. A wonderful, wonderful length as well. Taylor's has long been renowned as the epitome, really, of a vintage house. That their speciality is their vintage ports. That's a little unfair, as I think I've explained, that they invented white port, they invented LBV. They were one of the first houses to produce a range of 10, 20, 30 and 40-year-old ports, and they have these incredibly old stocks of Collita, of vintage tawny ports as well. But their fame has always been for their vintage ports, and Vargelas has always been their flagship estate. So in terms of relative value, a declared vintage from Taylor's is £70 or £80 a bottle, as opposed to £25 to £30 for an undeclared year vintage of Vargelas. They do produce a small amount of Vargelas in declared vintage years, but it's from the oldest vines on the Vargelas estate. And these old vines produce a very, very small amount of very concentrated fruit. And that's very special indeed. So you may see some Taylor's Vargelas, which seems inordinately expensive compared to the regular single quinta vintage port. And that's because it's from those old vines. That's because it's from a declared vintage. But Vargelas is the flagship of an estate which is famous for its vintage port, and it really is very, very good. Sue's asked, does LBV have a shelf life? The filtered LBVs do. They do have a shelf life, and it's not measured in decades usually. If you've got an unfiltered LBV like Wars do, Fonseca do, Sandeman's actually have switched their LBV recently from a filtered to an unfiltered style, so it's now got a driven cork, and I've moved it around on the shelf so it sits next to the crusted ports, the ports that have thrown a sediment. That's the crust that they talk about on the label sometimes. So your LBV in the cellar from 73, it may well be very drinkable, absolutely delicious. It will depend on the cellar conditions, but it will have more of a chance if it's been unfiltered than if it's a filtered LBV, like the one we tried this evening. Whoa. Does anybody have any other questions about port, about Taylor's? I would say decanting a vintage port, there's a degree of ceremony involved. I've shown you my little gadget, my little funnel with its built-in filter. That's very useful. If you haven't got one of these, what you can do is just get a pair of old nylons, clean, of course, cut out the toe, spread it over the top of your decanter, push it in slightly, and then pour your wine through that, and it makes a fantastic filter. The one thing I would say is, do not ever use a paper coffee filter for filtering wine, particularly port, because you end up with a cardboardy, papery taste in the wine. The sort of plastic coffee filters, reusable coffee filters that are commonplace, they're absolutely fine, but I wouldn't use a paper filter. A pair of old nylons works just perfectly. So I've about run out of things to say. We've gone a little over the hour. I do hope that that's unpacked some of the mysteries surrounding port and the various styles. Do experiment. There are lots of cocktails you can make with white port, with inexpensive ruby ports and tawny ports. Try them chilled. Try them chilled with a warm chocolate pudding. You won't go back, I promise you. And try tawny with a wide assortment of cheeses. It works with cheeses other than Stilton, and don't be put off by all the ceremony and paraphernalia that attends a vintage port. It's worth going through because the flavours are so wonderful. LBV does a great job of giving you a taste of the potential of vintage port, but really vintage port is a unique style unto itself, and it's worth going through the effort to open and decant the wine to appreciate its qualities. It really is. thank you all for joining me this evening. I'll try and make this available on my YouTube channel, and share it with you all if you know, if you want to see it again, or whatever. If you've got any further questions about port or wines and spirits in general, you know where I am. I'm in the basement of John Lewis, Oxford Street. You can reach me via email, andy.evans@johnlewis.co.uk, or andy.evans@waitrose.co.uk. Both reach me, and I'm there at work 5 days a week, ready to help you find your perfect bottle. Thank you very much for joining me this evening, as I say, and cheers.